Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever to come out of Minnesota's frozen fields. This video is a work of fiction made just for fun. Any resemblance to real people, living or dead, is completely coincidental. Picture it being winter in 1903 now. The wind cuts through the northern United States plains like an invisible blade. The snow is so thick that it drowns out all sound. We are in Otter Tail County, which is a place where farms stretch out like islands in a white, quiet ocean. The nearest neighbors are miles away, and the dirt roads are covered in meters of ice. It's a place where secrets can be easily hidden, and silence is not only common, it's complete. Minnesota used to be known for its Scandinavian immigrant communities, where hard-working people built their lives with their own hands and dealt with temperatures as low as minus 30 degrees. The barns kept animals and food safe during the long months of being alone. The houses were made of thick wood. It was a place where strong people lived, but it was also a place where anything could happen without anyone knowing. Thornwood Farm, as it was known in the area, was on the edge of the county and was surrounded by pine forests that seemed to watch over everything. By local standards, the main house was very big. It had 2 floors, narrow windows, and a porch that creaked under the weight of the snow that had built up on it. There was a path that led from the house to the barn that was about 50 meters long. In the winter, it was almost impossible to get to. It was the kind of place that felt like it had been there forever, as if the years had passed without changing it. Elias Thornwood was the owner. He was a mysterious man who had come to the area from somewhere in the east in the late 1880s, but no one knew where. He didn't come to town very often, and when he did, he only said what he needed to buy what he needed. People who lived nearby said he was polite but distant, and that his eyes seemed to hold stories he would never tell. His wife, Margaret, was even more private. Some people said she was sick and had to stay at home, while others said she just didn't want to be seen. People would wonder for years what happened on that farm in the winter of 1903. It all started when a traveler named Samuel Hendris stopped by the property to get out of the rain. Samuel was a traveling salesman who went from farm to farm selling tools, fabrics, and other small items. He was familiar with the roads in the area and knew that it was best to find shelter before the blizzard hit when the sky got that dark. Later reports say that Samuel knocked on the door of the house at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sky was already a dull gray, and the first snowflakes were starting to fall. Elias Thornwood opened the door and let the traveler in after a moment of doubt. Back then, it was normal to offer shelter to people who needed it during storms. Refusing would have been almost unthinkable in that community. What Samuel found in that house would start a mystery that no one could fully explain. A few candles and the faint light that came through the ice-covered windows were the only things that lit up the main room. The air smelled strange, like burnt herbs, and something else he couldn't place. Margaret Thornwood was sitting in a rocking chair by the fire, but she didn't turn to greet him. Instead, she rocked back and forth slowly, staring at the flames. Elias gave Samuel a room upstairs and a bowl of stew. The traveler agreed, happy to get away from the cold that was starting to get worse outside. He tried to talk to Elias during dinner, but Elias only answered with one word. Margaret didn't eat anything and stayed in her chair, rocking back and forth in the same way. Samuel felt uneasy for no reason, as if something was very wrong in that house. Samuel heard noises coming from the basement that night while the storm was going on outside. They weren't the normal sounds of an old house settling under the weight of the snow. Instead, they were rhythmic and repetitive, like someone banging something against the stone floor. He tried to ignore them, telling himself that they were just his imagination running wild because of the strange place he was in. But the sounds went on for hours, until they finally stopped just before dawn. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world covered in pure white. Samuel went downstairs to see his hosts, but the house was empty. Elias and Margaret were gone, taking with them any explanation for what had happened the night before. The upset traveler left the farm as soon as he could and promised himself that he would never go back there. The story of Thornwood Farm was just getting started, though. Samuel Hendress's first night on the property would be the first chapter of a story that would unfold over the next few months, revealing secrets that had been hidden there for much longer than anyone could have imagined. 3 days after leaving Thornwood Farm, Samuel Hendress got to Fergus Falls. The trip, which would normally take a few hours, had turned into a long, tiring walk along roads blocked by snow. His horse tripped over itself every step of the way, and the sled full of goods felt twice as heavy as usual. Samuel wasn't just tired from working out. He was also haunted by the memory of that house, those sounds, and the strange couple who had disappeared without a trace. At that time, Fergus Falls was the business center of the area. It was a quickly growing town on the banks of the Otter Tail River. The main streets were made of bricks, and the shops were lined up in neat rows, selling everything the farmers in the area needed. It was also a place where news spread quickly. People would gather in taverns and stores to talk about what was going on farms far away. Samuel went right to the inn where he usually stayed when he came to the city. Otto Lindquist, the owner, noticed right away that the traveler was different. Samuel, who was usually talkative and funny, could barely talk. There were deep, dark circles around his eyes, and his hands shook a little as he held the cup of hot coffee. Samuel didn't tell Otto what happened at Thornwood Farm until the second night. At first, the words came out slowly, as if he was afraid no one would believe him. But as the story went on, his voice became more urgent. He talked about the dark house, the weird smell, Margaret rocking in her chair without looking at him, and most of all, the noises that came from the cellar during the storm. Otto listened without saying anything, and his usually happy face got more and more serious. He knew Thornwood Farm, or at least he knew the stories that went around about it. The older people whispered these stories, and most people thought they were just superstitions from immigrants who still believed in the dark legends of their home countries. Otto said that the property had a strange reputation even before Elias Thornwood moved there. The land used to belong to a family of settlers who came to the area in 1867, not long after the major wars there were over. Otto couldn't remember the name of this family, but they had done well at first. The land was good for farming, the winters were harsh but bearable, and for a few years everything seemed to be going well. Then, in the early 1870s, the family just left. They left the property without selling it, telling the neighbors, or leaving any reason for doing so. When other settlers came to see what had happened, they found the house empty, but in great shape. The clothes were still in the closets, the food was still in the pantry, and the furniture was still where it belonged. It was as if the people who lived there had just disappeared in the middle of a normal day. The property was empty for more than 10 years. Even when the price dropped to very low levels, none of the people who lived there wanted to buy it. People didn't want to be there for some reason. Visitors said they felt like there was a weight on their chest and an inexplicable sadness coming from the walls of the house. Some people said they heard voices when they walked by the property at night. The whispers seemed to come from all over at once. Elias Thornwood showed up at that time. He came from somewhere in the east to the area in 1889 and bought the property for a price that no one thought was fair, but no one questioned it. He didn't want to know why the place had been empty for so long, so he didn't ask about its history. He just signed the papers, paid in cash, and moved to the farm with his wife, Margaret. The first few years were peaceful, or at least they seemed to be. Elias would come to town every 2 or 3 months to get supplies. He was always alone and quiet. People never saw Margaret in public. Elias would only say that his wife was sick and wanted to stay home when people asked about her. People believed the explanation because back then it was common for women to live alone, especially on farms that were far away from other people. But over time, rumors started to spread. People who drove by the property said they saw strange lights in the windows at night. The lights moved from room to room in ways that didn't make sense. Some people said they heard music coming from the house on full moon nights. The song was one that no one knew and was played on an instrument that no one could name. Some people even said they saw people moving in the fields around the farm, even on the coldest winter nights. Otto told Samuel that he had tried to go to the property once in 1897 to offer to bring food. Elias met him on the porch, was polite but firm, and turned down the offer without saying why. Otto felt something he could never fully explain while he was there for a few minutes. It felt like the house itself was watching him, judging him, and deciding if he was a threat. Samuel grew more and more uneasy as he listened. What he saw at Thornwood Farm wasn't just in his head. There was something wrong with that place, and other people had noticed it over the years as well. But what bothered him the most was that Elias and Margaret were gone. In the middle of a snowstorm, where could they have gone? And why would they leave the house without locking the doors or taking their things? The next morning, Samuel made a choice that would change everything. He would go to the county sheriff's office and tell them what he had seen. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do, but he knew he couldn't just forget about what had happened. Someone had to look into that farm, find out what happened to the people who lived there, and most importantly, find out what was hidden in that basement, where the sounds that still haunted his dreams came from. In 1903, Thomas Brennan was the sheriff of Otter Tail County. He was a veteran who had worked in the area for almost 20 years. People knew him for being practical and not believing in supernatural stories. Brennan listened to Samuel's story with an expressionless face as he walked into his office that winter morning. He wrote down notes in a worn leather notebook from time to time. The sheriff was quiet for a long time after Samuel finished, tapping his fingers on the oak table. After that, he said something that shocked Samuel. He said that this wasn't the first time he had heard strange things about Thornwood Farm. Over the years, at least 6 travelers had come to his office with similar stories. Stories of strange sounds, strange behavior, and a heavy feeling that seemed to fill every corner of that property. Brennan had never looked into these reports seriously because there was no proof of a crime. But the fact that Elias and Margaret had apparently left the farm in the middle of a storm was different. That needed to be checked out. So, almost a week after Samuel spent the night at Thornwood Farm, a group of people would go to the farthest reaches of Otter Tail County to find out what was really going on there. As soon as the roads were safe for horses and sleds, the trip to Thornwood Farm was set for the next day. Sheriff Thomas Brennan got together a small group of trusted men, including his deputy, a young man named Patrick Gallagher, and 2 farmers from the area who were familiar with the roads in Otter Tail County. Even though every part of Samuel Hendress's body told him to leave and never look back, he insisted on going with them. The group left Fergus Falls in the morning when it was clear but cold. The pale, far-off winter sun barely warmed the air that felt like 1,000 invisible needles on the men's faces. With every step, the horses snorted clouds of steam, and the sleds glided over the packed snow with a rhythmic, almost hypnotic sound. During the trip, no one talked much. Everyone could feel the tension in the air, but no one wanted to say anything. It took about 4 hours to get to the property, which is a lot longer than normal. The snow had built up to the point where the roads became real white mazes, and if you didn't know every curve, tree, and rise in the ground, it was easy to get lost. The farmers who were with the group acted as guides, showing them landmarks that would be hard to see without training. The sun was already going down in the west when they finally saw Thornwood Farm on the horizon. The property looked even more isolated than Samuel remembered. It was a dark spot against the huge white space that went on and on. The main house stood like a quiet guard, with its dark windows looking like eyes watching for people coming. The barn was a few dozen meters away, and the door banged slowly in the wind, making a sound that echoed through the quiet. Sheriff Brennan told the group to stop about 100 meters from the house. He wanted to look around the area first, looking for signs of movement, occupation, or anything else that might give him an idea of what had happened there. But there was nothing. No smoke came from the chimneys, no light shone in the windows, and the buildings were quiet. It looked like the farm had been left behind, like a picture of a moment that had already passed. After watching for a few minutes, Brennan told the group to move forward. The men got off their horses and tied them to a wooden fence that marked the edge of the property. As Samuel got closer to the house, his heart started to race. He remembered everything about the night he had spent there, as if it had just happened hours before. The front door was open, just like Samuel had left it when he left in a hurry days before. Brennan pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked for a long time, as if the whole building could hear it. The heavy curtains blocked most of the sunlight, making the inside of the house dark. The smell that Samuel had noticed on his first visit was still there, a strange mix of burnt herbs and something else that made his stomach turn. The men walked in one at a time, being careful not to make the wooden floor groan under their weight. Samuel's memory of the main room was spot on. The rocking chair where Margaret had slept was still next to the fireplace, which was now cold and full of ashes. The table where Samuel had eaten still had the leftovers, which were now frozen and covered by a thin layer of ice that had formed inside the house. Brennan carefully looked at each room on the ground floor, including the kitchen, the pantry, and a small office that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Everything was in order and in its place, but it also looked like it had been left alone for much longer than the few days since Samuel's visit. It was like the house had aged decades in just 1 week, as if time moved differently inside those walls. Patrick Gallagher was the one who found the first big clue. There was a door in the office that you couldn't see at first because it was hidden behind a dusty bookcase. The door was thin and dark wood, which made it blend in with the wall panels. It didn't seem to have a handle. Patrick found it by accident when he leaned against the bookcase and felt something move behind it. Brennan looked at the door again with more interest. After a few minutes of searching, he found the small lever that opened it. It was hidden in the frame of a picture of a seascape. With a soft click, the door opened to show a narrow staircase that led down into the dark. The door led to the basement, where Samuel had heard the sounds that night when the storm hit. The sheriff turned on a flashlight and started down the stairs, with his men close behind. At the door, Samuel paused. His body wouldn't take the step his mind knew he had to take, but he couldn't back down now that he had come this far. He took a deep breath and followed the others into the dark space that opened up under the house. The basement was a lot bigger than anyone thought it would be. The walls were made of rough stone, and the floor was surprisingly dry even though it was winter. Brennan's lantern only lit up a small circle around the group, and the corners of the room were completely dark. The air down there was different from the rest of the house. It was heavier, older, and full of a feeling that none of the men could put into words. They started to understand that the basement wasn't just a regular storage space as they moved forward. There were shelves against the walls, and on those shelves were dozens, maybe even hundreds, of strange things. There were glass bottles with liquids of different colors, wooden boxes with carved symbols that no one knew what they meant, and piles of yellowed papers with writing in a language that seemed both familiar and completely foreign. There was a big oak table in the middle of the basement that had been stained over time. There were instruments on the table that looked like they belonged to a different time, maybe even a different world. There were drawing compasses, graduated rulers with measurements that didn't make sense, and polished metal spheres that made the flashlight light look strange. And in the middle of everything was a book with a complicated diagram on one of its pages. Lines and circles crossed each other to make a pattern that seemed to move when you looked at it directly. Brennan carefully walked up to the table and looked at the things without touching them. As sheriff for many years, he had seen a lot of things, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a regular farmer's basement. It was the office of someone who did a lot more than just farm and raise animals. Samuel knew right away where the sounds he had heard that night were coming from. There was a machine in a corner of the basement that was mostly hidden by a heavy fabric curtain. It was hard to say what it was exactly. It was a mix of gears, levers, and other parts that didn't make sense on their own but together made something that looked like it had a purpose. The machine was now stopped, quiet, and still, but there were marks on the dirt floor around it that showed it had been used a lot, and recently. What was Elias Thornwood doing down there? What did that machine make or do? And where were they and Margaret now? Everyone in the room had more and more of these questions, but the answers always seemed to be just out of reach. The cellar of Thornwood Farm held secrets that would not be easily revealed. These secrets had been grown and kept safe for years, maybe even decades, away from the eyes of the outside world. Brennan told everyone not to touch anything until he could bring in more men and equipment to properly record what they had found. Finding that basement changed the investigation completely. It wasn't just about a couple who left their house during a storm anymore. It was something much bigger and more complicated that would take time and care to fully understand. The sun had already set completely by the time the group came out of the basement and back into the main house. The Minnesota winter had made the outside world dark, and the stars were starting to show up in a sky that seemed to go on forever. The men knew they had to leave before it got any colder, but they also knew they would come back. Thornwood Farm had only shown a small part of its secrets. There were still many more to be found in the dark corners of that place, where time had forgotten them. The group got back to Fergus Falls that same night, just as the clocks were about to strike 11 o'clock. The trip back had been almost completely silent, with each man lost in his own thoughts about what they had seen in the Thornwood Farm cellar. The lanterns on the sleds cut through the darkness like little beacons of hope in a sea of icy shadows. But no amount of light seemed to be able to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over everyone. Sheriff Brennan stayed in his office all night, trying to put his notes in order and come up with a theory that made sense of what was going on at that property. He couldn't think of any category that the things they had found in the basement fit into. He couldn't tell what kind of tools they were. They weren't farm tools, medical equipment, or tools for any trade he could think of. They were something else entirely, something that seemed to belong to a world of knowledge that was separate from the normal world and not visible to most people. Brennan made an unusual choice the next morning. He sent a message to the state capitol, asking for someone who could help identify the things that had been found. In 1903, Minnesota didn't have many people who knew a lot about advanced or strange scientific topics, but there was a university in Minneapolis that might be able to help. Brennan sent the message by telegraph and could only hope that someone would be interested enough to make the long trip to Otter Tail County. The sheriff decided to look into Elias Thornwood's past more closely while he waited for a response. He started with the county's own records, like property sale and purchase papers, certificates, and any other official documents that might have information about the man who bought the farm in 1889. What he found was both eye-opening and upsetting. The papers showed that Elias had bought the land from a bank in St. Paul that had taken it over after years of neglect and unpaid taxes. The deal was all cash, which was a lot of money at the time, and Elias had only given a post office box in a town in Massachusetts as his previous address. The county records didn't have a marriage certificate, which meant that Elias and Margaret had gotten married somewhere else, or maybe weren't even legally married. Brennan also found something interesting in the old sheriff's office's correspondence files. About 5 years after Elias moved to the area, in 1894, a nearby farmer made an official complaint about strange lights and sounds coming from Thornwood Farm on several nights in a row. Henrik Olsen, the sheriff at the time, had gone to the property to look into it, but his report was strangely vague. He only said that he had talked to the owner, that everything seemed fine, and that the complaint had been put away without any further action being needed. Brennan noticed a handwritten note in the margins of the report that seemed to have been added by Olsen himself at a later time. The note had 3 words that didn't make sense in the context, but they scared the current sheriff. Brennan didn't know much Latin, but with the help of a local priest he was able to translate the words. The translation was both easy and strange. It just said, "Do not disturb again." Why had the last sheriff written that note? What did he see or do while he was at Thornwood Farm that made him leave that strange warning? Henrik Olsen died in 1899, taking with him any answers he might have had. However, the note said that there was something on the property that had scared him so much that he had to stop looking into it and never go back. Samuel Hendris tried to get back to his normal life at Otto Lindquist's Inn while Brennan went through the files, but it seemed like normalcy was impossible to reach. He dreamed about the basement, the quiet machine, and the bottles on shelves that held liquids of colors that couldn't exist. He would wake up several times during the night, drenched in cold sweat, and feel like something was watching him from the dark. Otto saw that his guest was getting worse and worse and tried to convince him to leave Fergus Falls and never look back. But Samuel felt like he had to stay with this story for some reason he couldn't explain. When he stepped into Thornwood Farm that stormy night, it was like he had joined something bigger that wouldn't let him go until it was over. 3 days after the first expedition, Minneapolis sent a reply. A college professor who studies ancient history and symbolism was interested in the description of the objects found and was willing to go to Otter Tail County. Dr. Edmund Ashworth was an English scholar who moved to Minnesota in the early 1890s. He was known for looking into strange cases that other scholars would rather not deal with. In the middle of January, Dr. Ashworth came to Fergus Falls on a gray day. He looked very distinguished, with gray hair that was perfectly combed and a mustache that was carefully trimmed. He wore clothes that were clearly better than what most people in the area wear, and he carried a leather briefcase that looked like it had tools and other things he needed for work. His deep blue eyes seemed to be scientifically curious about everything and everyone around him, almost to the point of being intense. Brennan met with the academic in his office and spent a few hours going over the details of what they had found at Thornwood Farm. Ashworth listened carefully and asked questions every now and then that showed he knew a lot about things that the sheriff could barely understand. When Brennan talked about the symbols carved into the wooden boxes and the writing on the yellowed papers, the professor's eyes lit up with a gleam that could have been excitement or worry. It was hard to tell which. Ashworth stayed quiet for a few minutes after hearing the whole story. He drummed his fingers slowly on the table as he thought about what he had heard. Finally, he spoke in a deep, measured voice that showed how much he had thought about and studied the subject over the years. He said that what Brennan had described was like things he had read about in ancient texts. These things had been going on the edges of society for hundreds of years, always hidden, always denied, but always there for those who knew where to look. The professor said that some people have always tried to find out what is possible and what isn't, even when science thought it was impossible or unimportant. These people often worked alone, away from the prying eyes of neighbors and the law. They came up with theories and experiments that mixed ideas from ancient philosophy, simple chemistry, and metaphysical speculation. It wasn't magic in the way that superstitious people think of it, but it also wasn't science in the way that modern people think of it. It was something in between, something that was somewhere between the logical and the unexplainable. Ashworth wanted to go to the basement. He thought he could figure out exactly what Elias Thornwood was up to by looking at the things and papers that had been left behind. And maybe, just maybe, he could find out where the couple had gone and why they had to leave their jobs so suddenly. The next day, a new expedition was planned. This time, the group would include Dr. Ashworth and his analytical tools, as well as the sheriff and his men. Samuel Hendris also insisted on being there, even though Otto didn't want him to because he was worried about his guests' safety. Thornwood Farm waited for them in silence, keeping its secret safe in the dark cellar where sunlight never reached. The second trip to Thornwood Ranch left Fergus Falls in the early morning, when the sky was still pink from the winter dawn. This time, the group was bigger. It included Sheriff Brennan, his deputy Patrick Gallagher, 2 ranchers who had been there the first time, Dr. Edmund Ashworth with his instrument case, and Samuel Hendris, who seemed more determined than ever to find out what really happened. The trip went smoothly, and the road was a little easier to drive on than it had been the week before. The winter sun was bright, but it didn't really warm up. It only gave off light. The horses moved forward at a steady pace, breaking the ice that had formed on the snow overnight with their hooves. No one said much. Each person in the group was getting ready in their own way for what they would find when they got to the property. Dr. Ashworth read through a notebook he had brought with him on the trip. He would sometimes murmur words in languages that the other people on the trip didn't understand. Samuel looked at the academic with both interest and suspicion. The professor made him uneasy because she seemed to know more about the strange subjects they were studying than just being interested in them for school. It seemed like Ashworth was not only studying these things, but also somehow taking part in them. Ashworth was the first to notice Thornwood Farm when it came into view. He leaned forward in his sled seat and stared at the property with an intensity that was almost obsessive. He said something about how the place was perfect, and how the land's lines followed patterns that most people wouldn't notice. The others looked at each other in confusion, not sure what the professor meant, but too scared to ask. The group got off their horses in the same places as before and tied them to the wooden fence that marked the edge of the property. The house was just as they had left it, with the front door still open and the windows dark like blind eyes watching the world without really seeing it. But this time, there was something different in the air. It was an electric tension that made the hairs on their arms stand on end, even through the thick winter clothes. Ashworth was the first to go into the house, even though the sheriff, who wanted to lead the group, told him not to. The professor moved with a confidence that made it seem like he had been there before, even though he hadn't. He walked straight through the main room and into the office where the secret door had been found. He then began to look at the mechanism that opened it with clear professional admiration. The others followed him in silence, watching as the scholar walked down the stairs to the basement with the ease of someone going down the stairs of their own home. The flashlight he had made shadows on the stone walls that looked like they were moving on their own. The air in the basement was thicker than Samuel remembered, and it smelled like metal, which it hadn't done on his first visit. Ashworth spent almost an hour looking at each item in the cellar, writing down what he saw in great detail in his notebook, and using strange tools he had taken from his briefcase to measure things. He carefully handled the jars and read the yellow papers with such ease that it seemed like he knew exactly what the strange writing meant. He stopped for a long time when he finally got to the machine in the corner of the cellar. He was just thinking about how complicated the gears and levers were. Then, to everyone's surprise, he started to laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy or relief. It was a laugh of recognition, of confirmation of something he had long suspected. His eyes shone with a light that wasn't just from the flashlight when he turned to look at the others. He said he had been looking for something like this for 30 years, following broken clues in old texts and little-known stories. Now, finally, he had proof that his ideas were right. Sheriff Brennan wanted answers. He wanted to know what that machine was, what Elias Thornwood was doing in the basement, and where the couple had gone. Ashworth smiled with a patronizing patience that made Samuel very angry. The professor said that some answers couldn't just be given. They had to be found over time by people who were ready to hear them. He did, however, give some initial information that only made the mystery deeper instead of clearer. Ashworth says that Elias Thornwood was not just a regular farmer who was interested in strange things. He was a member of a secret society that had been around for hundreds of years and was dedicated to exploring the lines between the physical world and other planes of existence that mainstream science would not accept. Members of this society had learned things and developed skills that let them do things that would seem impossible to most people. They used the machine in the basement as one of their tools for experiments. Patrick Gallagher asked what the machine did right away. Ashworth took his time before answering and chose his words very carefully. He said the machine was a kind of portal, not in the way that a door opens to another place, but in the way that it opens up the very fabric of reality. It let some energies flow from one side to the other. These energies could be used for different things, some good and some not so good. A chill ran down Samuel's spine. The rhythmic sounds coming from the basement that he had heard that stormy night suddenly made horrible sense. While he was inside, the machine was running. While he was trying to sleep upstairs, Elias and Margaret were doing some kind of ritual or experiment that he had no idea about. Brennan wanted to know how Ashworth knew so much about the secret society and what it did. The professor was quiet for a moment, and his face showed a mix of pride and maybe regret. Then he said that he had been a member of the group when he was a kid and still lived in England. He had broken away from the group years ago because he was unhappy with some of the things they did that he thought were too dangerous. However, he had never lost interest in the knowledge the group kept safe. This news changed the way the group worked together right away. Brennan looked at the professor with open distrust, and his hand automatically went to his gun holster. The farmers stepped back a few steps to put some space between themselves and the academic, who now seemed much less trustworthy than when he first arrived. Samuel was the only one who stayed where he was, his curiosity fighting his fear in a fight that had no clear winner. Ashworth felt the change in the air and raised his hands to show that he was giving up peacefully. He said that he had left the group because he didn't agree with its most extreme actions. He said that he had spent his whole academic life studying these things from a scientific point of view, trying to figure out what was real behind the stories and rituals. He was really there to learn, not because he had any other plans. The sheriff didn't seem completely sure, but he chose to keep looking into the matter with the professor under more watchful eyes. There were still a lot of questions that needed to be answered, and it was clear that Ashworth was the best person to help them find those answers. Also, if the academic was up to something, it would be better to keep him close so you can watch him than to let him do what he wants. Before Ashworth left the cellar, he found one last thing that would be very important to what happened next. There was a small diary bound in black leather behind the machine, hidden in a crack in the stone wall. The pages were filled with Elias Thornwood's careful handwriting, which described what he did on the farm for more than 10 years. The diary would hold the key to figuring out what had happened on that land and what might still happen. That same afternoon, Elias Thornwood's diary was taken to Fergus Falls and handled with the care of a valuable artifact that could break at the slightest careless touch. Sheriff Brennan insisted that the document stay with him, but he let Dr. Ashworth look at it in his office, where he would always be watched. Samuel Hendris was also allowed to be there while the reading was going on, because he was a key figure in the events that led to the investigation. The sheriff's office had become a temporary study, There was a big table near the window to take advantage of the light, and several lanterns were set up for when it got dark. Ashworth sat in front of the journal like a priest would sit in front of a holy book, his fingers shaking a little as he opened the worn leather cover. The first pages of the diary were from 1889, the year Elias moved to the area. It was clear that the person who wrote it was disciplined and educated because each word was carefully formed. Elias wrote in English, but he often mixed in Latin phrases and sometimes phrases from other languages that Ashworth thought were ancient Greek or maybe Old Hebrew. The first entry told the story of Elias's arrival at Thornwood Farm and how he felt about it. He wrote about the property with a level of excitement that was almost euphoric, saying over and over that he had finally found the perfect location to continue his work. He hinted at a quest that had taken up years of his life, taken him to several states, and would finally end on that remote piece of land in Otter Tail County. Ashworth told the others that Elias had clearly not chosen the property at random. People in the society he belonged to thought that some places were better for their experiments because they had certain qualities. These traits were related to the land's geography, the minerals in the soil, how close it was to bodies of water, and other things that regular science would think were unimportant. It seems that Thornwood Farm met all of Elias's needs. The following entries show how the basement was set up to be a lab. Elias went into great detail about how he built the shelves, got the tools, and made the secret door that would keep people from seeing his work area. He often talked about Margaret, always with love, calling her his partner in both marriage and his secret studies. They had met years before in Boston, where they were both interested in learning things that most people in society didn't like or were afraid of. An entry from 1891 said that the group had finished building the machine they had found in the basement. Elias called it the amplifier, which Ashworth knew right away was a technical term used by the secret society to describe devices that could amplify certain subtle energies. It took almost 2 years to build, and Elias had to get materials from places as far away as Europe and the Middle East. The tone of the entry was one of quiet joy, as if Elias couldn't believe he had finished the project. The next few years were less well documented, with entries spaced out by weeks or even months. Elias talked about tests that were done with the amplifier, and the results were mixed, with some being good and some being bad. There were reports of strange things that couldn't be explained logically, like lights that appeared in the basement with no clear source, sounds that seemed to come from places that didn't exist, and feelings of presence that both he and Margaret had during work sessions. An entry from 1896 was a big turning point. Elias wrote with clear excitement about a discovery he made during a very intense experiment. He said he had made contact with something that was outside of the physical world, an intelligence or force that reacted to what the amplifier was doing. Elias's words didn't make it clear what kind of contact this was, but it was clear that he thought the discovery was the result of decades of work and study. At that point, Ashworth stopped reading, and his face became serious, which worried the other people there. He said that what Elias said was in line with the secret society's biggest goals, which many members thought were too risky or impossible to achieve. The goal of esoteric studies was to communicate with forces outside of the physical world, but people who cared about their safety and sanity thought that this was a line that should not be crossed. Sheriff Brennan cut in to ask Ashworth if he really believed in those things and if he thought it was possible that Elias had really made contact with something supernatural. The professor answered carefully, saying that it didn't matter what he personally believed. What mattered was that Elias really believed, and that belief had shaped his actions for years. To understand what happened at Thornwood Farm, you had to understand Elias's point of view. After 1896, the tone of the writing started to change slowly. The initial excitement turned into something darker and more obsessive. Elias talked about spending longer and longer sessions with the amplifier, even whole nights in the basement trying to deepen the connection he had made. Margaret started to show up less often in the pages. When she did, it was usually because people were worried about her health or how uncomfortable she was getting with the way the experiments were going. An entry from 1899 showed that the couple was very far apart. Margaret had talked to Elias about what she thought was a dangerous obsession, saying that they had gone too far into unknown territory. Elias talked about the conversation with a mix of anger and sadness. He understood his wife's fears, but he insisted that they were about to make a discovery that would change how people think about reality. He promised to be more careful and moderate in what he did, but later entries showed that he had not kept that promise. Samuel became more and more uneasy as he listened to the reading. The diary painted a picture of a man whose obsession with a quest had gone too far, dragging along a wife who had once shared his interests but had since become a victim of his obsession. From this point of view, the night Samuel spent at the farm took on new, terrible meanings. He wasn't just a traveler looking for shelter from a storm. He had unknowingly walked into the middle of something that had been going on for more than 10 years. The last few diary entries were the most upsetting. The letters were written just a few weeks before Samuel's visit and talked about experiments that had results that even Elias had trouble explaining. He talked about things that happened in other parts of the house, sounds and visions that haunted both him and Margaret, even when they weren't using the amplifier. The last entry was written the day before Samuel got there. It was short, just a few lines of handwriting that had lost all its former beauty. The letters were shaky and uneven, as if the hand that made them was having trouble keeping control. The words were easy to understand, but they had a meaning that made everyone there feel cold. Elias had only written this: "Something came through the portal, and we couldn't send it back. We need to leave before it's too late. May heaven have mercy on whoever finds this place after us." There was complete silence after those last words were read. Sheriff Brennan looked at the diary like it was a snake that was about to bite. Samuel felt like the walls of the office were closing in on him. The terrible truth of what had happened at Thornwood Farm finally became clear to him. Dr. Ashworth stayed still, staring at something far away as he thought about what they had just found out. None of them could have guessed how the investigation would turn out. It wasn't just about finding a couple who had left their home. It was also about figuring out what Elias Thornwood had let loose in his basement and whether it was still there waiting for the next person to walk into that cursed house. The group's shock at what the diary said lasted for a few minutes. Sheriff Brennan was the first to speak up. His voice showed both doubt and worry, which was how everyone else felt inside. He was a practical person who dealt with everyday crimes and fights between neighbors, not stories about portals and beings from other worlds. But there was something in what Elias Thornwood said that rang true and couldn't be ignored. Dr. Ashworth slowly closed his journal and sat in silence for a long time, deep in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice no longer sounded like a smart person. He said that while he was in the secret society, he had heard stories about experiments that went wrong and practitioners who opened doors they couldn't close. He had always thought these stories were either lies or metaphors, moral lessons that were told as if they were true. He was starting to doubt that certainty now. Samuel Hendriss's stomach began to turn as he listened to the professor. He had slept in that house, eaten at the same table as Elias and Margaret, and walked the same hallways where something was said to have been released. It was almost too much to think about that some unknown force might have been there while he was there. Patrick Gallagher, the young deputy sheriff, asked the question that everyone was thinking. If Elias and Margaret had run away from something they couldn't control, where had they gone? And most importantly, had they been able to get away, or had that thing caught up with them before they could get to safety? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, and each one was more disturbing than the last. Brennan made a choice right then and there. Thornwood Farm needed to be shut down and kept away from visitors until they could be sure of what had happened there. He would write to state officials and ask them what to do in this strange situation. In the meantime, no one should go near the property for any reason. Ashworth agreed with the choice, but he made a comment that made things even more tense in the group. He said that if what Elias wrote was true, just staying away from the property might not be enough. Some forces, once set free, didn't stay where they were. They moved around, looked for new places to live, and new sources of energy. Thornwood Farm could just be the center of something that's already happening. 3 things happened that night that would confirm the group's worst fears, while Fergus Falls slept under the icy blanket of the Minnesota winter. Samuel woke up screaming from a nightmare at Otto Lindquist's inn. It was so real that it took him a few minutes to convince himself he was awake. Brennan said he heard the pages turning inside the sealed metal in the sheriff's office, where the journal was kept in a safe. At Dr. Ashworth's house, where the professor had been staying for a short time, all the candles went out at the same time at midnight. This left him in total darkness, while a voice that wasn't his whispered words in a language he knew all too well. The next morning, they found something that would completely change the investigation. A farmer who lived about 10 kilometers from Thornwood Farm came to Fergus Falls with a story that made Brennan's hair stand on end. Something had come to his property at night. He couldn't say what it was, but he knew that his animals had gotten scared. Strange lights had appeared in the fields, and when he looked in the morning, he saw marks on the ground that didn't belong to any animal or person he knew. The farmer wasn't superstitious. He had lived in that area for more than 20 years and knew every sound, shadow, and oddity of the land. But what he had gone through the night before was too strange for him to understand. He wanted to know what was going on in the land he thought was his safe haven. He wanted answers, protection, and to know what was going on. Brennan, Ashworth, and Samuel looked at each other in a way that meant something. It was happening faster than anyone thought it would, just as the professor had said it would. What Elias Thornwood had let loose in his basement was no longer just in that one house. It was moving, growing, and affecting other people and places. They were the only ones who knew what they were up against. In the days that followed, more disturbing reports came in from homes all over Otter Tail County. Farmers who had never talked to each other more than politely came to Sheriff Brennan's office with stories that were eerily similar. Lights in the fields at night that couldn't be explained, sounds that seemed to come from all directions at once, animals that wouldn't go into barns where they had always slept peacefully, and a constant feeling of being watched even when no one was around. The map that Brennan had put on the wall of his office started to tell a scary story. The pattern that came out was clear. The pins marked properties where strange things had happened, and these incidents made an irregular circle that got bigger from a central point. And that center point was exactly where Thornwood Farm was. It felt like something was coming from that place, like an invisible wave that touched everything in its path. Dr. Ashworth spent hours looking at the map, writing down numbers in his notebook, and looking up information in books he had brought with him from Minneapolis. He thought that the Elias amplifier had made a break that stayed open even when it wasn't being used. The energy that was flowing through this break was spreading out across the area around it, which is what residents said they saw. If his theory was right, the events would keep getting worse and spreading until the break was somehow fixed. Samuel Hendris was no longer the man he had been before he came to Thornwood Farm. He didn't sleep or eat much. He spent his nights pacing the halls of Otto's inn like a ghost that couldn't settle down. The nightmares that haunted him were always different versions of the same thing, seeing the dark cellar, the quiet machine, and Margaret rocking in her chair while something moved in the shadows behind her. He knew he should leave Fergus Falls and never look back, But something he couldn't understand kept him there, in that story that had become a part of him. A week after finding the diary, something happened that made the group have to do something more extreme. A family that lived only 5 kilometers from the town left their home in the middle of the night and arrived in Fergus Falls in a state of total panic. Henrik Magnusson, the head of the family, was a strong man known for his bravery and calm demeanor. When he tried to explain what had happened, he could barely put together sentences. Henrik said that something had come into his house during the night, but not through doors or windows, which were still locked and intact. It just appeared in the rooms, as if the walls didn't exist. He talked about a presence that couldn't be seen directly, but could be felt in the air getting colder where it passed, candle flames bending toward it, and things moving on their own as if pushed by invisible hands. Henrik's wife and family confirmed every detail of the story, their voices shaking with fear that they hadn't been able to deal with yet. They had been hiding in a corner of their room for hours, huddled together while the presence moved around the house, looking for something or someone. They had run away without looking back when it finally left just before dawn, leaving behind everything they owned. Brennan set up temporary housing for the family and called an emergency meeting with Ashworth and Samuel. With the resources they had, they couldn't control the situation any longer. The strange lights and sounds were no longer just that. Something real was happening that could get into locked houses and scare whole families. If they didn't act quickly, panic would spread through the area as quickly as the events themselves. People had mixed feelings about Ashworth's proposal, with some being horrified and others reluctantly agreeing. He thought that the only way to stop what was happening was to go back to Thornwood Farm and try to fix the hole that Elias had made. The professor had looked over the papers he found in the basement and thought he had figured out how Elias opened the portal. Theoretically, the same steps could be taken to close it. Samuel strongly objected to the idea. Going back to that house was crazy, especially now that they knew what was loose. But Ashworth said there was no other choice. If they left the breach open, the phenomena would keep getting worse forever. If nothing was done about what was going on in Otter Tail County, it could spread to the rest of the state and maybe even the whole country. Brennan stayed quiet for a long time, thinking about the impossible choices he had to make. He didn't believe in supernatural forces, but the things that had happened in the last few weeks had shaken his beliefs to their core. People he had promised to protect were in danger, and something was going on that didn't make sense. He had to try to fix the problem if there was even the smallest chance that it could be fixed. That night, they made the decision to plan a new trip to Thornwood Farm, but this time it would be for a very different reason than before. They wouldn't just look into things or gather proof. They would try to undo what Elias Thornwood had done, shut the door he had opened, and keep the secrets of that cursed cellar hidden forever. Preparations started right away. Ashworth made a list of things that would be needed for the closing ceremony. Some of these things would have to be made up with what was available in the area. Brennan got a group of men he could trust together and told them he needed volunteers for a dangerous mission. He didn't go into detail about what the danger was, though. There were a lot of people who wanted to help, which was surprising. People in Fergus Falls were scared, and many would rather face the unknown than keep living in fear. Samuel made a choice that shocked everyone, even himself. He volunteered to go on the expedition and go back to the place that had haunted his dreams since that terrible first night. He couldn't put it into words when someone asked him why. It was clear that this story had started with him and that it needed to end with him as well. It was a logic that didn't make sense on the surface, but it touched on a deeper truth that he couldn't ignore. The trip was planned for 3 days later, which was enough time to get supplies and get the people ready for what they would find. No one knew what to expect when they got to Thornwood Farm, but everyone knew they wouldn't be the same people when they left. Some people might not even come back. The 3 days of getting ready went by so slowly that they tried everyone's patience and nerves. Dr. Ashworth worked hard to get the materials he needed and to read the papers that had been found at Thornwood Farm. To undo what Elias had done, he needed to know exactly what he had done. Each page of the manuscripts added new levels of complexity that made the job even harder. Sheriff Brennan's main job was to plan the logistics of the expedition and keep the people of Fergus Falls calm. Reports of strange events kept coming in, getting more common and closer to the center of town. There was a real sense of fear in the community. Families locked their doors at night and stayed inside during the dark hours. Samuel Hendris spent most of his time alone, either walking through the snow-covered streets or sitting quietly in Otto's inn. He tried to get ready for what was going to happen, but he didn't know how to get ready for something that didn't make sense. His nightmares still kept him up at night, but now they were different. In addition to being scary, they also had a strange sense of inevitability, as if everything that had happened since that first night on the farm was leading up to this final moment. The night before the trip, Ashworth called everyone together to tell them what he had planned. Elias's amplifier had made a hole between the real world and something the professor called the other side. To close this hole, they would have to do something that was basically the opposite of what Elias had done in the first place. To make this happen, the machine would have to work together. Ashworth would have to say certain formulas he had found in the documents, and a lot of luck would have to be on his side. The professor was honest about the dangers. He didn't know if the procedure would work. He wasn't sure they would finish it before the presence on the farm tried to stop them, or that everyone would make it out alive, or even at all. But it was the only choice they had, and every day that went by without doing anything was a day when the phenomena spread and affected more people. The volunteers who had come forward for the mission listened to Ashworth's words with a range of emotions, from grim determination to barely hidden fear. They were just regular guys, farmers and merchants, who never thought they would end up in this situation. But they were also part of a community that was in danger, and that was stronger than any one person's fear. The sky was gray and full of clouds that promised more snow when the expedition set out in the morning. The group left Fergus Falls shortly after sunrise. A line of sleds and horses crossed the white landscape toward a place none of them wanted to go. The trip was almost completely quiet, with only the sound of hooves on the snow and the animals' nervous neighing breaking the silence. The mood started to shift in small but noticeable ways as they got closer to Thornwood Farm. The air felt thicker and harder to breathe. The clouds made the sunlight weak, and it seemed to get even weaker, as if something were blocking the rays before they could reach the ground. The horses became restless and tried to break free from the reins and go off the path that led to the property. The farm looked like a dark wound in the white landscape on the horizon. It looked like the house had gotten even worse since the last time I was there, even though it had only been a few weeks. The walls looked like they were leaning, which they hadn't done before, and a few windows had broken, leaving black holes that looked like empty eyes watching the group come closer. The barn had partially fallen down because the wood structure couldn't hold up an unseen weight. The visitors were most impressed by the air around the property, though. There was a different quality to it. It was dense and made each breath feel like work. There was also a sense of presence that wasn't in any one place, but rather filled the whole space like an invisible mist. Everyone felt it, even those who had been doubtful until then. There was something there, watching them and waiting for them. Ashworth was the first to get off, and his academic determination seemed to be stronger than any fear he might have felt. He had a heavy bag with the things he had collected, and he held his notebook under his arm like a shield against the unknown. The others followed, but not all of them were happy about it. Some made religious gestures to protect themselves that they had learned in their home countries. Going into the house took a lot of courage from everyone. The last time they came, the front door had been ripped off its hinges, leaving the entrance wide open. The inside was darker than it should be in broad daylight, and the shadows seemed to have their own substance, moving in ways that didn't make sense. The smell that Samuel had noticed on his first visit was much stronger now. It was no longer just burnt herbs. It was something organic and disturbing that made his eyes water. The group moved forward in a tight formation, with flashlights on even during the day. Each man kept an eye on the people around him. Brennan was in front with his gun drawn, even though everyone knew that bullets would be useless against whatever was hiding there. It was more of a comforting gesture than a real defense, a familiar anchor in a sea of strangeness. When they got to the office with the hidden door, they saw the first real proof that they weren't alone. The bookcase that hid the basement door had been moved. This time, instead of being pushed aside like they had done before, it had been ripped off the wall and broken into pieces that were all over the floor. The door to the basement was wide open, and from the dark rectangle of the opening came a low, steady sound, like the deep breathing of something too big to fit in that space. Ashworth walked up to the opening and looked down. His lantern barely lit up the darkness that stretched out beyond the first few steps. He looked at the others with a look that showed both fear and determination. He said they had gotten to the point of no return. They had to do whatever they were going to do right away, before the presence that lived there fully understood what they were up to and decided to stop them. One by one, the people on the expedition went down the stairs to the cellar of Thornwood Farm, which was the center of the mystery that had taken so many lives and disturbed so many dreams. In the dark below, where Elias had built his machine and opened his door to the unknown, the fate of a whole region would be decided in the next few hours. This time, the basement was different. The dark down there seemed to be alive, and the group's flashlights flickered like candles in a storm. Elias's amplifier was in the middle of the room, but now there was something around it, a distortion in the air that made it hard to look directly at the machine without feeling very dizzy. Ashworth got to work right away, putting the things he had brought in certain places around the device. As he looked at his notebook, his hands shook a little as he double-checked every detail of the procedure he had put together from Elias's papers. The other people in the group made a circle around him to protect him, and their flashlights shone on the shadows that seemed to get closer and closer. Samuel stayed close to the stairs, torn between wanting to run away and needing to see this story through to the end. He could feel the presence in the basement, not as something he could see or hear, but as a constant pressure on his mind, like an alien mind that watched the group with either curiosity or hostility. As soon as Ashworth started reading the words he had found in the manuscripts, the mood changed. The temperature dropped a lot, and the air got so cold that each man's breath made thick clouds of vapor. The shadows in the corners of the cellar started to move in strange ways, reaching toward the middle of the room like tentacles of living darkness. Brennan told the men to stay where they were. His voice was strong, even though he was scared. They had come for a reason, and they couldn't back down now, not when they were so close to finishing it all. The sheriff couldn't understand what Ashworth was saying, or the symbols the professor was drawing in the air with exact hand movements, but he could tell that something was going on. The distortion around the amplifier was moving, getting smaller like a muscle getting ready to work. It seemed like the procedure took hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Ashworth worked with complete focus, ignoring everything else going on around him, and only paying attention to the words and gestures he needed to do perfectly. The presence's resistance seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The shadows became more aggressive, the cold became more intense, and the sounds became more disturbing. Then, in a moment that everyone there would remember forever, everything came to a stop. The shadows went away, the cold went away, and the air went back to normal. The amplifier was still in the middle of the basement, but the distortion around it was gone. Before, there was a heavy feeling of an alien presence. Now, there was only the usual emptiness of an abandoned underground space. Ashworth dropped to his knees, tired from all the work he had done. When he looked up at the others, tears ran down his old face. He said in a hoarse voice that it had worked. The breach was closed, the door between the worlds was closed, and whatever Elias had freed was back on the other side. The group came out of the cellar without saying a word, each man dealing with what had happened in his own way. While they were down there, the sun broke through the clouds and shone on the snowy landscape in a way that seemed almost magical after the darkness they had been in. Thornwood Farm was behind them, but it looked different now. The walls didn't look slanted anymore, and the windows didn't look like empty eyes anymore. It was just an old, empty house. Brennan told people to close off the property and put up signs saying it was off limits. The basement would be filled with dirt and rocks, and the amplifier would be buried under tons of material that would make sure no one ever found it again. Eventually, the house would be torn down, and the land would be left alone so that nature could take back what had been disturbed for so long. A few days later, Samuel Hendris left Otter Tail County and went back to being a traveling salesman. He never traveled the roads of northern Minnesota again. The things he saw and did at Thornwood Farm would stay with him forever, coming back to him in dreams and times of quiet thought. He never told anyone the whole story because he knew they wouldn't believe him. Dr. Ashworth went back to Minneapolis where he finished his studies and then retired a few years later. He never wrote anything about what happened in Otter Tail County because he thought it was too dangerous to talk about. When he died, the university got his papers, but the papers about the Thornwood Farm had mysteriously gone missing from his collection. No one ever found Elias and Margaret Thornwood. Some people said they had gotten away and were living in a faraway place under fake names. Some people said they hadn't gotten away at all, and that the presence they had let loose had taken them with it when it went back to the other side. Like so many other things about that farm, the truth was still a mystery. The weird things that happened in Otter Tail County stopped completely when the breach was fixed. The families who had left their homes came back, and life in the area went back to how it was before Elias Thornwood came with his secrets and plans. Over time, the story faded from memory. It became a local legend and then just a whisper among the oldest residents. Some people say that on certain winter nights, when Otter Tail County is covered in snow and there is no sound, you can still feel something strange in the air near where Thornwood Farm used to be. A brief feeling that something is watching from the shadows, waiting for the day when another door will open and the secrets on the other side can once again touch our world.